The historian George Bernstein defines the famine as such. The Irish mythology of the Great Famine of the 1840s explained the failure of the British government to prevent the deaths of some 1 million people in terms of a Whig government and a ruling elite driven by a commitment to laissez-faire ideology, which left them indifferent to the loss of such Irish lives. At its most extreme, this mythology attributed a willful genocide to the English. The term myth here does not necessarily imply the account is untrue. The famine was undoubtedly an exceedingly significant event in both Irish and British history. However, the nature of the consequences are often hazy, many politically motivated interpretations making it very difficult to get a clear picture. I'm going to be doing my best to take a balanced and unbiased approach. I'm also not going to be going too far into the causes of the famine, at least as far as I can. However, if there's enough demand, I'll be sure to do it. The Catholic Church played an instrumental role in the life of Irish citizens before and after the famine, and this did not change during the event, instead providing for the people of Ireland relief to the tune of millions of pounds, significant portions of it coming from the United States, where through donations over £2 million were sent to Ireland, bypassing the slow and often inefficient government apparatus for aid. Furthermore, the predecessores nosotros, the Pope spread awareness of the famine to every single Catholic congregation across the globe, doing much to facilitate this aid. It's not all good, however, as the Pope and international church hierarchy is widely criticised for their continued insistence on the giving of alms despite the famine. These made up 3 of the 11 points in the papal encyclical previously mentioned, along with resentment over the amount of land owned by the church, still being one of the largest landowners on the Isle. The famine forced the church into a difficult position. As resentment towards the British grew, organisations such as the Irish Republican Battalion and the Immortals expected support. However, the church went so far as to deny these considered as extra-parliamentary nationalists burials. An extra-parliamentary nationalist is someone who is unwilling to work within the bounds of constitutional law to achieve their goals, and as such were often violent. Think of the IRA. A constitutional nationalist, on the other hand, is someone who's willing to use legal means to achieve their aims, such as Daniel O'Connell, who established both the Catholic Association and Repeal Association, would eventually force what became known as the Emancipation Crisis in 1829. The Church therefore can be described as constitutionally nationalist for its support of O'Connell's movements. Indeed, during the 1820s they largely disavowed the politics of the larger Roman Catholic Church, denying what would be termed as popery, and beginning, along with other intellectuals in the period, to construct a separate Irish Catholic or insular Christian identity. Following the famine, therefore, there was little change in the role or power of the Catholic Church, instead choosing to reinforce their position as the pacifiers of Ireland, as claimed in their petition to Parliament in 1827, which was called the Petition of the Bishops. One significant change, religiously in Ireland, was the distribution and denominational structure of the Protestants of Ireland, with the Anglican Church of Ireland losing significant numbers of their followers in the famine. And yes, despite the claims of popular history, there was a similar amount of deaths between Catholics and Protestants in mixed areas, and an even larger share by way of conversion to Presbyterianism. The structure of Irish Protestantism changed massively. Furthermore, a rise in sectarian on both sides did much to encourage these Protestants found in the south to move to cities such as Belfast in Northern Ireland. This is a nice transition to the massive demographic changes in Ireland. Although around 1 million people died, this number cannot explain the vast depopulation of the nation, nor the eventual location of those who did survive and didn't emigrate. Almost 2 million Irish people would move to the United States alone, and yet more would cross the Irish Sea into British cities such as Liverpool and London. Internal migration too was substantial, with people largely moving to coastal cities and towns such as Dublin, Cork and Belfast. It's worth mentioning, however, that this was not some massive China-style urbanisation of the population, as Ireland today still remains largely agrarian. This wasn't just driven by food security, however, as much of the migration was the result of enclosure and the consolidation of Irish farmland and pasture. A number of radical government policies, such as subsidised land sales, as well as the transplanting of the so-called Ulster custom of land ownership to the whole island, contributed to this. Although many lost work due to the near eradication of the small 2-metre plots which had fed 1/3 of the Irish population, it did contribute significantly to food security. The vagueness of this legal custom, however, would cause a period of significant agrarian unrest termed the Land Wars, where tenant rights were enforced by armed farmers. However, this reform cannot largely be credited to either the British government or the famine alone. The famine, however, did change the nature of nationalism. As hinted at earlier when I was talking about the church, all forms of nationalism gained a great amount of legitimacy following the famine, and quite rightly. It also increased the prevalence of extra-parliamentary and violent nationalism, with organisations such as the Fenian Brotherhood, or Irish Republican Battalion, and the Immortals. Although these organisations would struggle to achieve popular mandate across the whole period, they did receive more support, something which extreme nationalists had struggled to achieve after their failures in 1794. The Irish question continued to dominate British politics. However, where the Irish MPs in Parliament prior to this period were often divided, the period following the famine saw a near 100 MP bloc within Parliament. This increased the power of Ireland over British domestic policy even further, and nearly every government formed until the First World War was elected on a basis of pacifying Ireland in one way or another. The Protestant-Catholic divide economically was also rapidly closed, as the literacy rates and prospects of Irish Catholics increased following the famine. However, the mixed communities, as previously mentioned, largely ceased to exist, with most Protestants heading north and Catholics concentrating in the south. As I mentioned earlier, with the Land Wars, tensions between landlords and farmers continued, with the word boycott coming from this period. Land wars, of course, would shape Ireland and can largely be attributed to the famine. The unindustrialised areas of Ireland, however, also remained largely unindustrialised, with it maintaining its pastoral nature up until the present day. The west of the island becoming the last refuge of the Gaelic language, and the most underpopulated of the whole region. Though more cattle was now raised, Ireland's economy was still dominated principally by crop farming. However, the potato blight largely prevented any cultivation of the crop, and therefore corn and other cereals became a staple on the island. Although following the famine many aspects of the relationship changed, such as the urgency felt by nationalists, the extent to which the general trend was different is limited by a continuation of the social, economic and political issues facing Ireland, and the means with which they were achieved. Although extra-parliamentary nationalism and armed conflict became more prevalent, the famine was not the direct cause. Indeed, the failure of the Anglo-Irish relationship, highlighted by the famine, was not seriously threatened until the Home Rule movement, some 20 or 30 years after the event. Thank you for listening. I have been Tomo, and this has been my talk.